I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Join me on a quest to find awe and wonder in all creation, human or wild, vast or small, spiritual encounters that move us beyond words.
I get a phone call from a funeral home, and I thought it was some goofy call where they wanted me to buy an early package for my funeral. I was very leery, and she said, my name is Renee, and I have a contract for your Aunt Shizuko Sugimoto. And it stunned me because I said, how does she know that name? And it was a name I barely recognized, but she said it was my mom's, Carol Sugimoto's sister. And I went, okay, that's my mom's name, so there's something to that. And it had my family's name with my mom and Shizuko's name on it. And I went, wow, this sounds authentic. And she said something that just moved my heart and continues to move it, where she said she didn't want my aunt to die alone.
When Renee from the funeral home called him, our guest in this episode of Constant Wonder, David Masumoto, who goes by Mas, knew next to nothing about his aunt. He was 58 years old at the time, and he'd never met her. What Renee was telling him on the phone seemed impossible.
My aunt was in hospice, and that's why a funeral home had this contract to take care of my aunt, and she was wanting not to let her die alone, so she was desperately trying to find family to connect.
How long had your family been out of contact with this aunt?
The last time my family had any contact was in August of 1942, when our family, my entire family, was interned at a relocation center in Gila River, Arizona, and uprooted from our home here south of Fresno. And at that time, they didn't know what to do with Shizuko because Shizuko had this intellectual disability. She had gotten meningitis as a 5-year-old and had the mental capacity of maybe about a 5-year-old. And they weren't sure what was going to happen with themselves, let alone would there be someone to take care of someone with special needs. So they put her in and made her a ward of the state, and that was the last time they saw her. And 70 years later, I get this phone call.
David Mas Masumoto is an orchardist, owner of Masumoto Family Farm, which specializes in organic peaches, nectarines, apricots, and grapes for raisins. His identity as a third-generation Japanese-American family farmer is pivotal to this story. For someone like Mas, who is practically a blood relative to the orchards and vineyards that he tends every day, hearing out of the blue about a branch of the family tree pruned off long ago threw everything he thought he knew about his family's story into chaos. That phone call would launch him into an investigation. What had happened to his Aunt Shizuko? Why the separation and the information blackout? Piece by piece, he would retrieve important aspects of her story, and on this journey also arrive at a new appreciation of his twin legacies of family and farm, discovering powerful symbolism in these orchard trees, which, I should put them on the map for you, lie just south of Fresno, in California's agricultural heartland, the Central Valley. To understand why a family would cut ties with their intellectually disabled daughter, she was only about 20 years old when her family last saw her, well, that story starts all the way back when Mas's grandparents were young.
Both my grandfathers were second sons. They weren't going to inherit the farm in Japan. So they came to America looking for a new dream, a new hope. And what they found was plenty of work in the fields and poor pain and poverty at the same time. But they thought it was better. And then they brought my grandmothers over from Japan. And they were, in a Japanese culture, they were called pitcher brides. They were arranged marriages. And it was almost as if we're all misfits that came. And really, most immigrants are misfits. They didn't belong in one place. So they came to this area of Fresno that was expanding agriculturally. So they found work in the fields. They didn't speak English, but there was communities of Japanese Americans here. My father's side came from Kumamoto, southern part of Japan, very rural, and my mother's side came from Hiroshima, again, a very rural area. So they worked in the fields, and life was okay. back then because they found work and they married and started raising family. And back then, again, realized the key to family was to have lots of kids because one, everything from infant mortality, but two, that was your social security. It was in having large families. My dad's side had 8 kids and my mom's side had 9. They grew up with this big, big family. From my sense, it was hard work, but the fields were amazing because the grapes here, the peaches, they didn't discriminate about who was doing their work for them. So my family felt at home with this. And I heard stories of growing up, and certainly I was like this growing up, where you spend childhood playing out in the fields. They were farm workers, but a lot of farm families took their kids out into the fields to work with them. So we would play under the grapevines. My mom, my uncles, Shizuko would play in the fields because that's where they found home.
To be clear, this new life in America for Masa's grandparents had made them agricultural workers on someone else's land.
When Japanese immigrated here, they could not buy land because there are these racist laws called alien land laws that prevented specifically Orientals from owning property. So they were destined to be farm workers. But the vineyards and the orchards of the valley were hungry for workers. You know, raisins were a very, very labor-intensive crop. And in a nutshell, to make raisins, you grow the vines throughout the year, but in the month of September, you hand-pick bunches of grapes, lay them on wooden trays back then. Now we use paper, but back then it was wooden trays, and they sit in the sun for about 3 weeks and dry into raisins. Then you put them in boxes. Very labor intensive, very risky because you're exposed to the weather at that time. But that was where a lot of workers found themselves fitting into a world, an agricultural world that needed strong backs and quick hands. And so they would work out during the day. And again, Fresno climate during the summers, it's 100, 110 degrees. It's the natural weather. It's very dry, which is perfect for peaches and grapes and raisins. But it was very hard on workers. But then most families, again, these are immigrants, they come back home and they tend their gardens. Why did they have their own gardens? Because they raised Japanese foods like daikon, which is, horseradish, or a napa, which is a type of cabbage, because that was their diet. That's what they ate. In order to make a living, they'd, wake up at sunrise, and we didn't have any labor laws back then. They'd work 12, 14-hour days, come home, and then at night take care of their home gardens. And it was almost a wonderful ritual for them, because that's where they found wonder, in that this was something that they could own, their own garden at least, and this is what nourished them, their own food. And it gave them not only something that was familiar, their diet, but also it was their identity. So my parents grew up with this, and many, many Japanese American families. Then I grew up with it too, eating these foods and thinking, why do we have this? We could go to a grocery store and get this. They go, no. These are special. And actually, it really helped learn the way I farm too, to understand how things have meaning, and especially in food. And that's what I try to grow and farm at the same time.
Mas has an infectious enthusiasm for growing food, which I think you're probably already hearing in his voice. It's a love that reappears as a theme throughout this episode. But let's stay with Masa's grandparents a little longer to understand how impoverished the family situation actually was. That poverty would come into play when 5-year-old Shizuko contracted meningitis. After Mas Masumoto began investigating his aunt's story, after that phone call, he asked his mother why the family didn't get medical treatment for their daughter.
And she looked at me and she said, we were poor. We were living out in a small rural town. There weren't many doctors, and being an immigrant, you tend not to have access to medical fields, especially you have to realize a lot of early hospitals were Christian-based, and we were Buddhist, of course. So they didn't even think of taking her to the doctor, and she ended up having meningitis. Of course, that expands the brain, and it damages the brain. So as a 5-year-old, that was her mental capacity. So after that, she never went to school. All the other brothers and sisters, my mom, my uncles and aunts went to school. Shizuko was often left at home and went out with the family to the fields.
And as I remember the story, your mom is 8 years younger than
Yeah.
Shizuko. And so if Shizuko contracts meningitis at age 5, that's before your mom's born.
Right.
So the only Shizuko that your mother would remember was the one who was ailing already from meningitis and the after effects.
Yeah, and my mom has the story, and I could totally understand it, being 8 years younger. She was kind of afraid of Shizuko, because here's the key. Shizuko growing up wasn't this quiet, meek little child. My mom called her feisty. Even, when my mom was like 5 years old and Shizuko was 13, and my mom was always terrified. Shizuko would kind of throw tantrums. She would throw things at her siblings.
So Shizuko's life began in poverty. Then came the medical tragedy of untreated meningitis, and these were only the beginning of many tragedies she would endure through life. Later, we'll hear how her feistiness likely helped her survive and even thrive at institutions that housed and cared for her. But imagine the unspeakable nature of something in her youth that Mas eventually learned had happened to her. Unspeakable because of the crime involved, but also literally unspeakable by Shizuko herself because of her intellectual disability.
Shizuko was left home alone. She was a teenager, maybe 15 at that time. And the parents went out to do farm work. My aunt said, oh, Shizuko was really attractive. And she had what she said, an hourglass figure. And I went, hourglass figure? No one uses that term anymore, but it was a demarcation of an attractive young woman. And I said, so what happened? They said, well, there was these bad neighbor boys. Apparently what happened is she got assaulted. Was she raped? How much was he assaulted? No one would verify that because they didn't want to talk about that. So as I'm probing into this story, I'm really grappling with this because if no one wants to talk about it, do I need to probe into it more? And what happened was I began to piece things together and realize that this was important, but it's not the only thing I wanted to remember Shizuko by. The key was my aunt then said, yeah, when the family came home, Shizuko had some torn clothes, was crying, and my grandmother got Shizuko, hugged her, and then got a scissor and cut off her hair so she would look like a boy. And that one line, to me, told all the details I needed to know.
It's so important at this point to remember that this is post-meningitis, a young girl who cannot speak and tell her own story. She can't even plead for help other than to cry.
All I know is that it was traumatic, and my family responded this certain way. And of course I said, well, why didn't you go to the police? Stop. Okay, this was a poor family, immigrants, didn't speak English. What would the police do in that situation? So it made me also realize the circumstances of my family history, of generational history of many, many of our families. And how it's so easy to judge things by today's standards. Why didn't my grandparents, why didn't my mom go to the police? Why didn't they say, we need to capture these bad neighbor boys? All these other forces come into play. And that was an important lesson. It wasn't to be accepting of it. This was the dynamics that my family, many of our families, all lived through, and understand that. And how does that leave its mark on who we are today?
If the Sugimoto family, including Shizuko's parents, didn't feel like they could go to the police about what had happened to her, they certainly were powerless against what was to come a half dozen years later when the U.S. government would intern their Japanese immigrant community far away in the Arizona desert at the Gila River Relocation Center. It's a world apart from the fruitful peach orchards and vineyards of Fresno, California. Our guest is David Masumoto, owner of Masumoto Family Farm and author of Secret Harvests, a hidden story of separation and the resilience of a family farm. I'm Marcus Smith. You're listening to Constant Wonder. I'd like to take just a brief moment here to introduce you to another gem from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's called In Good Faith. You can immerse yourself in a soul-nourishing experience of spiritual exploration. Stephen Cat Perry is the host, and he features people of diverse religions and spiritualities. He always interviews them with an aim to come upon a genuine understanding of the guest's relationship with the divine. Maybe you're wanting to strengthen your own relationship, or maybe you just feel a hunger for thoughtful conversation that touches on faith and belief. Whatever your need, it's truly rare these days in the media landscape to find conversations that unfailingly nourish and uplift your soul. In Good Faith does that every time, and you'll find it wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. To get a sense of how completely life was upended when Japanese-American farming communities were abruptly deported from their homes on trains and buses, let's consider what it meant in practical terms alone to work the land from the beginning of a growing season to its successful conclusion.
They got this notice that within a week or two, they had to pack up everything, get rid of stuff. It happened in August in the valley here, right before the raisin crop. So both families, the Masumotos and the Sugimotos, were renting land at that point. They had to find someone that would pay them for the work they did, and they got, pennies on the dollar for it, and they left. And then all these grapes were harvested in September. Whoever got the profits from that made a fortune on that.
Of course, it wasn't just crops or money these people left behind. There were personal effects, including family heirlooms and treasures that could not be packed into a suitcase. Consider Shizuko's father, Masa's maternal grandfather.
My grandfather, of course, was a farm worker, but also he was a carpenter. He really loved to work with hands and make things. Amazing story. They lived in a rented house, of course, but in the backyard, he started making these wooden pagodas of like a Japanese statue. He would make Japanese altars, butsudans, and he'd make this whole garden filled with these Japanese structures, miniature pagodas. And the story was that he would walk around in this garden with Shizuko, and my grandfather would revisit Japan, the land he knew he'd never get back to, but he could be in Japan walking through this little village he created, and Shizuko would walk with him and wander in this foreign land, but to her, this is a place where she felt accepted. My mom would tell stories that Shizuko seemed to be at peace when she was with nature and in nature. And then a sad story coupled with that, of course, our family had to leave all these wooden pagodas behind. When they left, went to this internment camp for 4 to 5 years, the story was the people who stayed here saw these as emblems of the enemy, so they burned them. And when they came back, they were all burned to the ground.
There is a story of something that did survive, though, from this time period. I believe an Armenian neighbor kept it.
Yeah. My grandfather was a skilled carpenter. So he made what they call butsudans, which are Buddhist altars. And we still have one in our house, and my daughter and my uncle and my cousin has one too. So he made these Buddhist altars, and they were much smaller. So the question was, during the week that they're frantically trying to pack whatever they could in a suitcase, what do they do with their belongings? Most of the things they just left behind, except these altars, they thought it was sacred. So they went to a neighbor thinking maybe a neighbor would keep this. But there was concern because these were pagan altars, and they went to an Armenian neighbor. And you have to realize Armenians had immigrated here to America because of the Armenian genocide. They understood the trauma of dislocation and relocation. So this wonderful Armenian neighbor kept these pagan altars in their shed for them. And when my uncles and aunts came back and my mom came back from the war, they went to the neighbor and retrieved these Buddhist altars. So it was just a slice into the amazing moment of relationships that overcome this war that was happening around them. And these dynamics of history, they get folded into something as simple and complicated as a butsudan, a Buddhist altar.
One of the challenges of trying to see through the eyes of people who lived so long ago, in that cultural context, decades ago, is to think in terms of the immigrant family that gives its sons to the U.S. military to fight in a war against the very country that family came from?
When you start piecing together more of these stories, the oldest uncle on my father's side, right, the number one son, he was drafted into the U.S. Army before Pearl Harbor. So he was caught in this really awkward situation, and my aunt would tell stories that she got letters from him in training camp that they took away his guns because they didn't trust him, but yet he's drafted into the U.S. Army. He eventually joined the 442nd, this very highly courageous and honored battalion of all Japanese Americans, and he died in France fighting. Meanwhile, during World War II, of course, 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast were uprooted and labeled the enemy and put into these camps, relocation camps, concentration camps, prisons, and kept there for years. My dad, second son, tried to keep the family together as much as possible. So they were at Gila River Relocation Center. And in the latter part of 1945, I believe it was, the U.S. Army was still fighting these wars. They drafted my dad. So out of the relocation camp, my dad goes to train in Alabama while all the family are back in this prison in the Arizona desert. It blows my mind to think about that. And there were stories of some Japanese Americans who resisted that. They said, no, they weren't going to go fight for the U.S. Army. And in a way, they're being recognized. At that moment, though, many of them were deemed as disloyal, because the premise was in order to become established here in America, we had to fight for America. And that was the attitude many Japanese Americans families had, even though they were in these prisons. Again, I could piece together these facts. I could sort of understand the situation, but sometimes I try to put myself in there. What would I have done during August of 1942? Would I have protested? Would I have run away? If I was in the relocation camp, would I have gone if I was drafted out of that? So now I'm beginning to be torn in 18 different directions, trying to understand, again, the context of history. And that's what makes this story.
Every family torn apart or displaced in wartime will have stories of suffering and potentially of making peace with that suffering. Every family, that's a given. But Mas's family saga was further complicated because of disability in the person of Shizuko and terminal illness in the case of grandfather Sugimoto, Shizuko's father.
My grandfather on my mom's side, the one who built the pagodas and everything, he was dying of stomach cancer. It was very, very ill. So they're trying to cope with that. And what do you do with that? And at the same time, they had this daughter, this teenage, I think she was 19 at that time, young woman. What did they do with her? Because they don't know where they're going. Would there be a place to take care of her? They had heard that, well, maybe she could become what they call the ward of the state. The state would take over. And the family, from what I could sense, said maybe she'd be better off because the state would take care of her. Ironically, this was the same state that was imprisoning them at the same time. It kind of blows my mind that they were willing to do that. But I think they didn't have much options at that time. There was a story that my uncle told me that when Shizuko and the county sheriff came to take her away, my grandmother made my uncle talk to the sheriff and say, I want you to make them promise they'll take care of her. And they used the Japanese term yakusoku, which means to hold the pledge of a promise. And in Japanese culture, there's the idea of you make a promise, you're going to carry through with it. Apparently, the sheriff said, I promise to take care of her.
As you've already heard, Shizuko couldn't tell her own story about being assaulted. It would be no different in this situation. Nor is it very likely she could have had any inkling about what was going on in this whole matter of relocation, other than the hard, cold fact of physically being separated. And with her compromised intellectual ability, it seems no one could have prepared her for the arrival of a sheriff, a stranger, coming to pick her up.
And I understand from my mom and my aunts and uncles, she did not speak. The only sad amazing moment was my aunt remembers as they were pulling Shizuko away from my grandmother, and both of them were crying. Shizuko would yell, "Mama, Mama." And my aunt said it just hit her in the heart to think that was what she heard in 1942, and those were the last words she heard from Shizuko until 70 years later.
When the families were finally released from the internment camp at Gila River in Arizona in 1946, having lived there for 4 years, what were their thoughts about this injustice they had suffered?
I grew up with this phrase called shigata ganai, which means it can't be helped. I was born after the war, grew up very Americanized, never learned Japanese until I left America. I heard shigata ganai a lot. It can't be helped. And I just assumed, oh, that's sort of like you're playing basketball and you miss a free shot. Oh, shigata ganai. It can't be helped, But then I start thinking about this. And then every once in a while I'd hear my dad say it, like if we had a hailstorm on our peaches, he'd go, shigata ganai. It can't be helped. Nature, weather controls life. It can't be helped. And I go, oh, okay. That means you're humbled by all this? Yeah. And then once in a while, especially later when I could speak Japanese, I talked with my grandmother. And whenever I brought up really a difficult subject like this, or even with my family, when we talked about Shizuko, they'd often shake their head and just say, shigata ganai. Having a child, a sibling with an intellectual disability in 1930s and 40s, it was something that you kept quiet. It couldn't be helped. It was so hard for me to grasp that as an American. It's like, no. Don't we have, power over our destiny? Don't we have control over different things? And then the realization that no, all of us face these forces. And certainly as an organic farmer now, I totally understand that when you look at climate change, how do we learn to live with it? Which is very different because many of us are brought up certainly in this new age of technology, of government, that no, we control things. The truth is, most things in life we don't control.
This cultural perspective, it can't be helped, surely factored into the family's capitulation to Shizuko becoming a ward of the state.
Yeah, well, see, realize in many ways, looking at the three generations that we're talking about, Issei, the immigrants, my grandparents, Nisei, my parents' generation, and me, Sansei, third generation, we all coped with a different America. We all coped with different situations that the family was part of and everything. And understanding we all had our own definitions of shigata ganai, it can't be helped. When you're an immigrant, right, you're just happy to have some jobs. Even though you may be abused, you may be cheated, you're just happy to be able to have and raise a family. And then my parents' generation, the Nisei, they were growing up much more American, and then World War II came when they're deemed the enemy. So what do you do with that? Hold a bitterness inside? Yeah, I think they did. But at the same time, you swallowed your pride and said, it couldn't be helped. We will try to move on and be the best we can. And that's why my dad, right after the war in 1948, he took this huge step and gamble and bought our farm, which was, full of hardpan rock, this mineralized clay that made the land virtually valueless. We have a very dry climate here in the valley, so as water evaporates out of it, it forms this hardened sheet of rock. You couldn't grow much on it, but it was cheap, so he bought this farm. The hard pan was like maybe 3 to 6 feet. Some farmers would get a bulldozer to crack the rock and take it out. When I was growing up, I remember seeing this box of dynamite in our shed. And then when I came back to the farm, I remember I looked up and I said, Dad, why do we have dynamite? And he said, that's how I got rid of the hard pan. And he told me the story. My dad's not a storyteller, and this took like 8 lunches for him to tell me the whole story. What he did was he would put a stick of dynamite under one of the layers of hardpan, light it, run away, it would explode, and he'd go back out there with a wagon and rock by rock clear it out. So now we have this beautiful land. It was him leaving his sweat and his optimism in that field to clear it. He said that in America, in order to plant roots, you had to buy a piece of America. And that was his way of saying, it can't be helped, so here's what I could do. So that's how he transformed this cheap dirt, this land, into our thriving.
These Nisei in Mas's family, these second-generation Japanese immigrants, were trying to put their lives back together, having scraped together enough to buy this cheap land to try to make something of and for themselves. During these years of transition, after arriving back from internment in 1946, then purchasing 40 acres in 1948, were they also trying to track down Shizuko?
They came back as farm workers, starving, begging for work because they had no food or anything. There was another story I heard from another cousin who said, Grandma Sugimoto and her dad, who was the third son, did see if they could look up and find Shizuko. So the story, and no one else would verify it, is that they did look up and found her at one of these large mental institutions. And when they met her, she was actually being fed. She was being taken care of. And they looked at their own lives coming back from this prison and starving. They were just farm workers at that time. And they said, she is being taken care of. We will not talk about her. She is done. She is gone from our lives. So the word was, my grandmother made my uncle promise they'd never tell this story. And everyone said they let go, I think is the term. I never heard this story till I was doing this research on Shizuko.
Of course, it was that phone call from that person named Renee at the funeral home that brought Shizuko back into their lives. Well, into Mas's life anyway, because at first he held off from telling his mother anything about that call.
I was in shock when I got this call because at first I didn't believe it. And of course, it came from a funeral home. It didn't make any sense to me.
Mas's Sugimoto grandparents never could afford a family photo. So obviously, Mas had never seen a family portrait, no image of Shizuko, but the name Shizuko did ring a bell.
Sometimes someone would make a family tree, and there would be this name, Shizuko, and no one said anything about her. So we all assumed she had died. So when this name popped up, I vaguely remember it from a few family trees that, a cousin had composed, but I had no idea of the other dynamics of it, especially of her intellectual disability. When I first went to go visit Renee at the funeral home, all the pieces started fitting together, but I was still, in disbelief, very skeptical about this. And I thought, but this doesn't seem to be a kind of a sham or something like that. Because I went to the regional center where Shizuko was a client of the government at that time, and they had records of Shizuko. And then I went to go see Shizuko at this assisted care center where she was laying quiet in a coma. And all the pieces hit me at that moment. And I went, are you kidding me? And then there was this flush of other emotions of, why didn't anyone talk about this? How could this happen? What happened in history? And all this was racing through my mind. But the bigger question was, how do I tell my family? How do I tell my mom this? So that was weighing on me in a huge way because I didn't know how to deal with this.
So you had actually started processing and investigating and talking with Renee before you had spoken a word to your mother, your family?
Exactly, because I didn't want to start bringing this up to my mom and without having done a little research and getting her concerned about this. Because as it turned out, it was the exact right decision to make. Because if I said, hey, I got this call from a funeral home and they talked about Shizuko, and my mom probably would have gasped then because she had, along with all my aunts and uncles, a sense of guilt and shame. Had they forgotten about this sister? And it was rekindling all these memories of our family history, of the history of Japanese Americans. And it was a very, very difficult time. And you have to realize my family coped with all the dynamics, the racism of immigration, of World War II, of being poor, of being not Christians. We were Buddhists. They coped with it by being quiet. So this culture of silence was part of our family. And I suddenly thought, well, am I supposed to be part of this silence and not follow up on this story? And I said, no, I'm from a younger generation that certainly was more Americanized. And I said, no, I'm going to pursue this. And then the pieces started unfolding. They were just random pieces that were falling on me at that time.
Did it ever cross your mind, Mas, that your mother or your extended family might have intentionally been hiding something other than just this culture of silence? Did it cross your mind that maybe you would open up wounds?
Yeah. One of the dynamics, especially looking at hindsight, was the understanding that all families have secrets. And some secrets are, very, quaint, kind of almost humorous. Others are major because it involves complex notions of family, of history, of immigration, of poverty, of wealth. All those dynamics come into play in all of our families. And it hit me right at that moment that was there something, a reason why they were hiding this story? And as I learned more that Shizuko had an intellectual disability, it suddenly hit me this whole notion of shame. Because certainly a generation ago and 100 years ago, people with an intellectual disability were embarrassing to families. They wanted to hide them. They wanted to keep them invisible because that's how people, sadly, were coping with a disability, especially a mental or intellectual disability.
Shizuko's disability, Japanese altars and small replicas of pagodas, the years of internment in Arizona, then starting all over again back in California. All of these strands are woven together so beautifully in Mas Masumoto's telling. As you might already anticipate, we're going to get to the moments when Mas's mother and her siblings see Shizuko once again in person after 7 long decades. And we'll hear more about how Mas has come to feel a connection, spiritual, maybe organic, between family and farming. Now, this is a perspective even he could not have foreseen in his young adulthood, given the fact that he actually fled as far from the family farm as he possibly could, with no original intention of a career in agriculture. I think his homecoming, his return to the farm, makes his insights all the more poignant, as will become clear in a bit. Mas Masumoto is owner of Masumoto Family Farm in the Fresno area. He tells his story in his recent memoir. It's titled Secret Harvest. I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. I want to shine a spotlight on another incredible show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's called Top of Mind, and it resonates in a big way with those who want to engage with the important, tough issues facing our communities, but who are dismayed by polarizing and divisive approaches to these issues. Each week, Top of Mind tackles one tough topic. Award-winning host Julie Rose talks with guests about complex, challenging perspectives, and the Top of Mind experience doesn't aim at persuading you to change your mind. Instead, it opens a door for empathy and clarity in the interest of becoming better citizens and kinder neighbors. Listen to Top of Mind wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder.
I was the youngest. I was never expected to take over the farm. I was the one that goofed around a lot. I wasn't the hard worker growing up on this farm. I screwed around a lot. I broke a lot of things. So when I was in high school, I said, I don't want to farm. Where shall I go to college? And I got lucky enough to be accepted into Berkeley. And Berkeley, of course, in the 70s, 60s and 70s was a pretty radical place. And I said, I want to go to Berkeley because I know my parents would never come visit me there. And they never did, but it was perfect for me because I was running away from the farm. So I ran away to Berkeley and I said, I'm going to study something that would never bring me back to the farm. So I studied sociology. Of course, the irony is that was the exact right thing to study to bring me back into a farm community and all the stories that I inherited. So I'm at Berkeley, and if it wasn't far enough, I said, I need to get away from the farm even more. I'm going to go study in Japan for 2 years as an exchange student. I went to Japan, and the twist of all things, when I was in Japan, I started thinking about our family roots. So I went down to the little village, my grandmother on my father's side, the Masumotos, a little village called Takamura, which is outside of Kumamoto, which is in southern Japan. It was a place where all these country people were. And I ended up living and staying in the farmhouse that my grandmother grew up in and working in the same rice fields. And I thought, wait a minute, this is the very life I'm running away from, and I'm doing the same thing. And I began to realize there's some affinity that I had to the land. And after I finished with Berkeley, I came back and I realized I want to be part of this. And then all these stories around me started flowing out about our farm, about my dad. We were growing these, old heirloom peaches at that time. He loved them because they had great flavor. And I remember growing up because I helped him plant that orchard. And I knew exactly the row I planted because his rows were nice and straight. Mine were crooked because I was a teenager at that time. I was thinking about, going to a movie or something like that, not planting these trees. And I thought it didn't matter. And here, decades later, I'm living with that crooked tree that I always have to swing the tractor around when I work the field. But it was part of that idea that we leave our fingerprints on the land and the identity of who we are. So we grew these peaches. I continued to then farm organically. We raised, all these heirloom varieties, married, had family here. My kids are on the farm working with me. We'll probably, quote, take it over, knowing that it will evolve as they grow older too. So it's all part of that legacy that helps define ourselves and also the foods that we grow.
Farming isn't just a career to him, not just economic activity. It's part of family identity. Mas sees a clear line from tending fields to tending family, while holding on to an inherited past or legacy that seems to inhabit the very land.
There's meaning around us. And for me, I look at our farm and realize I'm not the first one to farm this land. There are ghosts of the farmers before me. And really, there's the ghosts of all the workers who worked this land, who pruned these vines. We have 100-year-old grapevines in front of our house. Ghosts aren't necessarily this negative, scary thing, and that in many ways is the ghosts, the ancestors that I live with that define me, and I would like to think it's the part of the flavor of our peaches and our nectarines and our raisins. The flavor of those ancestors are part of it, and that's what gives meaning, and that's why you're not just buying a commodity, you're buying something with meaning, and I think the world is seeking meaning.
For me, there's a clear implication in Mas's worldview. Nurturing is intrinsic to the meaningfulness we seek in the world. Accordingly, giving care to plants, trees, and vines on the one hand, and caring for humans on the other, well, I'll take that back. It's all on the same hand, a hand that graciously cultivates and sustains life. Mas holds to a vision of beauty in helping everything thrive as best it can, assisting things to come to fruition, to abundant harvest. You could say he has a holistic view of family, field, and farm. Here's just one instance. His father, the man who first purchased and established the Masumoto farm, suffered a stroke at about age 75.
I was the one that nurtured him to get him back on a tractor because I knew that was his life. He didn't want to just live in a assisted care center. So I got him back to driving a tractor. And for the next 14 years, he had this full life of being who he was, a farmer. I understood this power of caregiving.
And yet Mas's family had not been the ones to care for Shizuko during or after World War II. And that, of course, exacerbated the pain of realizing that she was still alive. Yes, apparently someone had checked in on her when they first returned from internment, but 7 decades is a long time. Had she been consistently well cared for all those years? Remember when that sheriff had promised to look after her?
Now, did he really mean that? Here's the irony. She was taken care of for 70 years in institutional care. It's just mind-blowing to think that the promise was fulfilled. I knew she had to have people who took care of her Because that's the only way you survive 70 years of institutional care. This wasn't her living in these very lush places. It was really tough places, mental institutions, assisted care center for people on governmental support, etc., etc. They weren't these pretty, wonderful places. But in the story of Shizuko, especially the last place that she lived for the last 15 years, they were amazing. And they became her family. They often were underpaid, often people of color, often working in very, very difficult situations and didn't get credit for that. And when I go visit, I tried to be very understanding of them. And I think they saw me slightly differently, except I remember when I first saw Shizuko, I walk in and one of the young men that was helping to take care of Shizuko said, "Oh, who are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm her nephew." And he looked at me and he goes, "Where have you been for all these years?" And he was exactly right. And I realized, even though I was blood family, her family were these caregivers. They're the ones who took care of her, who nurtured her, and she in turn loved and engaged with them. So I'm so indebted to them. In fact, here's a little twist. We grow these peaches, and we actually, during the summer, have some extras. So I go to the assisted care center and drop off 20 boxes of these luscious, juicy, great peaches. And I remember when I first dropped them off, someone said, "What are these boxes?" And I said, "Well, they're for you. I want to thank you for taking care of Shizuko." And they felt really awkward, and it occurred to me, no one has ever given them a gift to take care of a loved one. And it just crushed me to think about that, because they didn't know what to do with this gift. And I went, oh my, this is just a whole nother world that was Shizuko's world for these 70 years. So it opened my eyes up to this whole notion of caregiving, both as a farmer, as a family man, as part of someone who works with extended family and my neighbors and community, but also this other often invisible world of caregivers that is full of amazement, of wonder that is often hidden.
Renee, that funeral home employee, did not work in healthcare, not exactly. Her expression of care came in reaching out to Mas Masumoto, hoping to find a relative so that Shizuko would not die alone. Shortly after he met with Renee at the funeral home, Mas went to see Shizuko for the first time. She was on her deathbed.
She's comatose. I tell all the family, they start coming to visit her, and they're trying to grapple with guilt, shame of 70 years, but there's Shizuko laying quietly, so we start planning for her funeral. And a month goes by, and she hadn't passed away. 2 months go by, and I don't understand, wait a minute, how is she surviving if she's comatose? 3 months go by, I get a phone call, Shizuko woke up. And I went, what? This made no sense. So I go see Shizuko. She's in a wheelchair, moving around like she has for decades, frantically. And first thing I saw her, I went up to her and I said, Shizuko, my name is Mas Masumoto. I'm your nephew. She looks at me and she kicks me. She kicks me in the shin. And it's because she wanted her shoe tied. That's how she survived. When she wanted something, she acted up that way. And then I asked the caregivers, how did you take care of her? And again, this wasn't a ICU unit or a special hospital. It was a pretty basic assisted care center.
When she fell into that coma toward the end of her life, the staff at the care center proved how well they could care for her.
They knew her so well, and they loved her. They figured out a way of tickling her on the side, and she'd sort of stir, and they could then feed her a liquid diet for 3 months. And they did it for 3 months, and then she woke up and lived for 2 more years. It was this second wave of emotions that suddenly the person that you're trying to cope with and have closure with is alive, and we have to go see her moving around, and it opened the door for more stories. And then trying to understand, how do I fit into all this?
From tending his orchard land, Mas Masumoto the farmer had learned some lessons in care that came to bear on how his family story might be rewritten now that Renee had led him, and through him the entire extended family, to Shizuko the survivor.
It was interesting because my family never directly told stories, but it was all this indirect storytelling, which is actually very powerful. So we'd be looking at the fall leaves as they're falling from the peach trees or the vines, and my mom would chime in and say, "Oh yeah, when you were a baby, we put you under the grapevines." And I know as a child what it was like. I did it with my daughter. We put her under the grapevine during the fall when I need to do some work. And then I found out that our grapevines that are 100 years old was once owned by a Japanese American family in 1910. So I thought, when Shizuko was born in 1919, did the family come and prune these vines? Wait a minute. Shizuko may have laid under these grapevines, just like I did, just like I laid my daughter under. And you start piecing together some of these dynamics, and you combine it with other things. We tend to think of storytelling in a real simple process, like in 3 acts, with a beginning, middle, and then a climax and an end. Life sort of works that way and sort of doesn't. That's just like farming, where, okay, we start in the spring, the blossoms come, then we work, we harvest in the summer, and we could relax in the fall, and then winter comes, dormancy. Yeah, there's those 4 seasons, there's those stages of development. But there's also much more. And a simple example is, when I started farming, that I need to understand what the name of the weeds are and how do you control these pests. And you begin to quickly realize we actually know so very little, right? There's this whole world of life out on a farm. And as the decades went by and our farm grew more organic, there's new life that came. Weeds that I never saw of. And I go, wait a minute, I need to stop calling them weeds, because weeds has this negative tone about it. They're part of the natural grasses of a farm. That's the same type of diversity that I see in the world around us. And Shizuko opened this new door. I, of course, grew up understanding issues of race and culture and religion, but I didn't understand the dynamic of mental and intellectual disabilities and that whole world of ableism. And now, this is another layer of diversity that's in the world around us. When I get the phone call about Shizuko, it added another layer. It's not me farming this land. It's my family, it's generations, and all the history that came with it. It's almost as if you understand that sense of ancestors and the meaning of ancestors and how they create this new type of awe and wonder in the work that we do.
The feisty Shizuko that you got to know in the wheelchair, apparently that's the way she'd been behaving for these 70 years. If she didn't like her food, she'd throw it over her shoulder. If she was done with her coffee, she'd throw it over her shoulder. If she didn't want to wear clothes, she'd strip down. She was just her own person, and she teased people.
Oh, all the time. One of the dynamics, again, getting to know the caregivers, they start telling me stories. And I said, well, how did you first meet Shizuko? And she was an administrator there. She said she first met Shizuko because she just got her office and had set up her desk to start taking care of things in this assisted care center. Shizuko snuck in and ripped and tore all the stuff off the desk and threw them on the floor and started laughing and ran away. Shizuko is about 4 feet 6 inches, 80 pounds. She's a little tiny lady. And she realized, who did this? This tiny little cute woman did all this. And they all began to realize Shizuko was feisty. She had life. She had energy. She loved to go and pinch people and giggle and run away. No differently than when I first met her, she kicked me, right? She had this kind of personality that I laugh at because I keep thinking and saying, I remember telling my mom, Shizuko isn't very Japanese American, is she? And they laugh at it. But that was that feistiness, that energy she had. In a way, this is what I interpret it. Shizuko didn't know she had a disability. This was normal behavior for her, and that's how she survived. She had life energy, had an awe within her, and that's how she lived. That's how she survived. And wonderfully for me, my family, and hopefully others, it was because of that feistiness, this whole story comes out. And you can see this broader story of history, story of identity, story of the meaning of life.
Shizuko's characteristic feistiness was reenacted at her funeral celebration. This involved copying what Shizuko had done so often in life after finishing a cup of coffee.
Shizuko loved hot coffee in the morning. And when she was done, she'd simply get the cup and throw it over her shoulder, no matter who was behind her. So at first they said, we're going to change from glass cups and mugs into styrofoam. And then they realized, oh, wait a minute, we need to put her with a wall behind her. Because she did it every day. She would just throw the cup behind her. I'm done. All right, what's next in life? And I thought about that attitude. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's full of life, full of this amazement of life to be able to do that. So at her memorial service in the funeral home that originally Renee was, it was only fitting to have it there. We had all the family there. Caregivers came too. And I said, we're going to do a ritual that will be the way that I think Shizuko would want us to remember her. So I passed out styrofoam cups to everybody. And I told the story that when Shizuko was done with her coffee, she was full of life. So she just fling the cup behind her. So I said, all right, everybody, on the count of 3, fling the cup. 1, 2, 3. The caregivers flung their cup because they had seen Shizuko do this for decades. All of my family were a little hesitant and they looked behind them because they didn't want to hit someone. And it was an amazing moment because they didn't quite get what kept Shizuko alive, but yet it was a fitting moment to understand this is the story of our family and also the story of the broader world where Shizuko fit and didn't fit at the same time.
David Mas Masumoto is the author of Secret Harvests, a hidden story of separation and the resilience of a family farm. If you'd like to visit his family farm, check out his website at masumoto.com. The farm's tagline, by the way, is "We Grow Stories." And you know that here at Constant Wonder, we're 100% on board with that. If you like the stories you've heard from us, please give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast platform or share a favorable review. It's a simple gesture on your part, but it helps us to bring you more of what you love. This episode was produced by Tenery Taylor with help from Lily Jensen and Elaine Scott. Sound design by Josh Fouts. I'm Marcus Smith. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.